Overall, the race, I think, exceeded expectations in just about every way it could, but I still have a lot to digest here. I think I went into this just taking my best guess at a lot of things. I think a lot of those guesses were wrong, but the biggest, most important thing I got out of this race was a much better sense of direction and a much better sense of really where I am right now. So the swim was probably the most unremarkable in terms of performance, but also the most exciting in terms of competition. For about the past couple of years now, every race I've done has either been, I've been way out in front of everybody else, just get out and drop everyone on the swim immediately, or that someone else has done the same to me, and so I've been kind of stuck in no man's land for an entire race. And finally, that actually didn't happen. The first 3 or 4 pairs of people out on the swim all kind of stuck relatively close together, at least for around the first half. For a good amount of time, I was able to stay on someone's feet and kind of pace off of them. The second half, we kind of spread out. The person in front of me ended up slowing down, so I passed and eventually dropped them. And the people who were out in front of me kind of just lost me entirely. But just having a bit of a group to go with for at least part of the race was very helpful and very exciting, and it really made it just a more engaging and fun race in general. Now, in terms of my own performance, it was about, give or take, what I would have expected. My overall goal was around 28 mid, maybe 28 low, and I think I ended up going about 26 mid. In hindsight, I really feel like it was a pretty conservative goal. It was, something that I felt would be moderately challenging, but that I would be able to reach pretty handily as long as I, focused and did well. Which is, that's fine for your first race at a specific distance, but it's definitely something that I want to push myself a little bit further on, focus on going closer to eventually 115, 100 yards, rather than 120. So throughout my Olympic distance career, races pretty much all went the same for me. I would finish towards the front of the swim, spend the next hour, give or take, getting past on the bike, and then claw my way back up on the run as far as I could. Grand Rapids did prove that still kind of is the case for me. While I didn't finish quite at the front of the pack for the swim, I did finish in a relatively forward position. I think I was 3rd overall getting out of the swim. I passed one person running up into transition, and then got passed by 3 people on the bike. And that's really about where I expected to be. I knew that I wouldn't be making up much ground on the bike on anyone, and I knew that other people would be making up ground on me. So while I wanted to stay within myself and focus on racing my own race, I knew that I would have to work hard on the bike, and that I would have some catching up to do later on. I did try giving chase a couple times that I got past, and was able to hold on for at least a little while, but for the most part, I just focused on doing what I was there to do. So mostly, my main enemy on this race was the course. It was a 1 lap out and back with about maybe 15 or so miles at the beginning and the end of mostly flat roads with some very gradual rolling hills. In between there was some big incline change. Mostly uphill going out, mostly downhill coming back. And while I did a decent job of pacing myself consistently throughout, I do think that I could have paced myself a little more smartly and more competitively. My goal was to take things relatively cautiously going out, see how I felt, and then recognizing that it was mostly downhill on the way back, try to negative split. While that would have worked, just taking the incline into account, what I did not take into account was that there was a tailwind going out and a headwind going back. The only real obstacle for me was really knowing not how hard I should go, but how much I should hold back and what I should have left myself for the run. And ultimately, I think I did a good job of that, but mostly just through luck and guesswork, not through having any specific plan. Granted, I can't be too disappointed though, because my goal was 2:30 on the bike, and I ended up going a little bit faster than that. My overall goal pace would have been about 22.4 miles an hour, and I think I ended up going a little over 23. Slightly slower, obviously, than I'm going at an Olympic distance, but still a pretty good pace for a half Ironman. Now I just need to work on pushing that a little further up
So I'm going more in the 24, 25 mile an hour range. And then I think I'll be a good bit more competitive.
By the time I got out onto the run, it was really and truly a proper time trial again. And while I looked out for anyone who could have possibly been passing me, there was enough space behind me and in front of me that nobody realistically was going to change positions by that time. We were all spaced out by a good 5 minutes or so, sometimes even more than that. So it was really just me and the course. And if the bike is where I tested the waters for a half Ironman, the run is where I really tested my limits. My goal was a 1:30 overall, or a sub 6:30 pace, which would have been a little bit faster. And I ended up pushing a 6:22 overall, so I certainly can't be disappointed at that. But it was not something that came easy. It was a heck of a lot of work. I had backed off a little bit at the very end of the bike to give myself a bit more time to recover and get going. But this was definitely not a flat course, so it was very hard to pace myself correctly. It's a bit of a downhill actually out of transition, so I got out at I think close to 6-minute pace. From there, tried to reel it back in a bit, but mostly just ran by feel and sort of stuck with where I felt in a position that I felt like I could hold. This ended up working for me, but also, you know, I probably could have done a little bit better. It was a 2-lap run course, and each lap had a couple pretty big uphill sections, followed by a significant downhill as well. And the first time through, they were hard. The second time through, I was nearly walking. I set myself the goal of absolutely no walking or stopping, but there were some times when I was shuffling along pretty damn slow. I think I took the downhill sections a lot too hard, and ended up really shredding my legs. Right now my quads feel kind of bruised, so lessons learned there. While I do think I held a relatively consistent pace throughout, I definitely slowed down in the last few miles after I was done with the last uphill section. I could really feel myself giving out, slowing down. I don't think I would have been able to hold this pace for much longer, so I'm glad it finished when it did. But I think I just gave a little bit too much in the beginning and just didn't quite have enough in the tank towards the end. And part of that's because I dropped some of my nutrition for the bike and was probably running a little bit unfueled and dehydrated. But overall, I think pacing needs a lot of work. My coach and I had set the race goal of going out on the first lap a little bit more conservative, seeing how it felt, getting used to the race course, and then seeing what I could do with the second lap and maybe even negative splitting. And I think I took it out, a bit too hard. But I do think that if I would have backed off a little more towards the first few miles, I probably could have done disproportionately better on the second half. So self-control is still something I need to really work on learning. But other than that, technically and competitively, I think it was a very good run for me. I'm not quite 100% satisfied. I'd like to see myself doing 6:15, 6:10, but for a course like this, where there's a lot of climbing and a lot of downhills that really tears up your legs, I think I'm definitely happy with the 6:22. My performance overall was enough to net me 5th, and that's pretty good, but it's also, looking at the race results, pretty clear where I need to put in the work. There were a couple people who, were able to swim incredibly fast and just destroy my time there. And there were 1 or 2 people who had really incredible runs, like almost sub-6 pace. But we all had pretty much the same transition times. And overall, I had, I think, one of the fastest swim splits and one of the fastest run splits. There were a good couple people who I outswam and outran that I just wasn't able to catch up to at the end because their bike put them so much further ahead of me. That's just where I need the most work right now. Over these next few months, and really the next few years, I really need to start pushing myself to, expand my perception of what is possible on the bike for me. Sometimes with performances like this, I can sort of get comfortable and almost complacent with where I am. And I need to break out of that, especially on the bike. If I want to be seriously competitive in triathlon, especially long distance triathlon, I really need to be able to not just survive through the bike, but really compete and push myself to keep up with a lot of the other triathletes out there who have more of a cycling background. All that said though, it's easy, especially for triathletes like us, to look at race results, to look at the place you got, and use that as an excuse to discount your individual performance. And I do feel like, in a big way, that's what I'm doing. My stretch goal here was to podium overall, and I got 5th, which is admittedly not what I wanted. But this was also my first half-ironman. It was my first experience in this distance. And on an individual level, I exceeded expectations everywhere. I was cautious about my swim. I ended up doing just as well as I thought I would. I had no idea what I would be doing on the bike or the run, and managed to perform relatively well in both, at least in comparison to what I've done before. I was on par and then some. So while it's not everything that I could have ever dreamed of competitively, I do still need to remind myself that it's what I set out to do, and I did it well and ultimately exceeded my own personal expectations. If anything, this just makes me a lot more excited about the road ahead. And while I was a bit nervous to make the jump up to half-ironman before this race, now I think I'm a lot more excited to commit to that. This race posed a lot of challenges, and ultimately I think I was able to rise to them. I'm definitely glad that I chose this as my first half-iron race. It was something familiar, but also very new for me, and I'm excited to go back there in future years. I do still have a lot of questions floating around in my mind about where I want to go from here, whether I want to keep committing to Olympic distance or really make the jump and focus on half-iron and full Ironman. But I think all of that can wait for a later day, and I think for at least a little while now, it's okay to get some recovery and be satisfied with what we did this past weekend. I've got one more minor race coming up in July, just to sort of get me used to the Olympic distance again, and after that, we're on to Nationals and Worlds. This is going to be an exciting race season. So while I wanted to stay within myself and focus on racing my own race,